Steamboat Christian Center. I'm Charlie.
And I'm Kaylin.
Yeah, and we are standing in front of
Rail Jam.
Yeah, this is actually in our parking lot. What happened here?
Yeah, we had an awesome event this past week for our youth. We had them just out here having a blast. So if you are a student, we would love for you to stick around and stay tuned for some upcoming events that are happening for you guys.
And
so stay tuned.
Speaking of upcoming, we're going to take all this snow out of the parking lot. And next week we are opening up.
We're opening and we are so ready to see you. We will be opening with 3 experiences, Saturday at 6 p.m. and then Sunday at 8:30.
Yep.
And our brand new time at 10 o'clock instead of 10:30.
People are going to love that.
Yeah, we can't wait.
And then the next week,
we have Easter. We have 4
Something we kind of
experiences
celebrate every
for
year.
you.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, we have 6 o'clock on Saturday and then we have 8:30 on Sunday, 10 and 11:30. So we can't wait for you.
A ton of opportunity.
Yeah.
But we have a big deal on Saturday. What's
we
that all
have
about?
our Easter egg hunt for our kids. And so if you want more information, go to steamboat.church/egg. And don't forget to get your kids registered. And we can't wait to see you there.
And until then, week 3 of Stuck.
I saw Satan fall like lightning, and I saw darkness run for cover. But the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. And I believe in signs and wonders, and I have resurrection power. Yes, I do. Still the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. Oh, my praise belongs to you forever. This is my testimony from death to life, 'cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. Yeah. From death to life. Oh. So come together, sons and daughters, bought with blood and washed in water. Sing the praises of the Spirit, Son, and Father. Our God will finish what He started. Yes, our God will finish what He started. Oh, this is my testimony from death to life, 'cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. Yeah. From death to life. Oh. Yeah. If I'm not dead, you're not dead. 'Cause greater things are still to come. Oh, I believe. If I'm not dead, you're not dead, you're not. 'Cause greater things are still to come. Oh, I believe. If I'm not dead, you're not dead, you're not dead, you're not. 'Cause greater things are still to come. Oh, I believe. If I'm not dead, you're not dead. 'Cause greater things are still to come. Oh, I believe. Yeah. Oh. This is my testimony from death to life, 'cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous, I'm justified. This is my testimony. Oh, I'm alive. This is my testimony from death to life, 'cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this weekend. Speaking of weekend, we are 1 week away from having in-person services here at the Christian Center, and I can't tell you how excited we are to see you and your families here live. So thanks for joining us today. Over the last few weeks, if you haven't been with us, we've been trying to answer a very difficult question. And the question is very simply this: what do you do when there's nothing you can do? What do you do? What do you do if you're in a situation or maybe in a season in life where you can't really go forward and you can't really go back? It may be a relational issue, maybe your marriage is kind of not all that great right now, and it's not really going anywhere, and and it's not getting any better, but you don't want to get divorced, you want to give up on it. So what do you do? Maybe it's financial. Maybe, things haven't worked out for you this last year, and financially it's really tough. And the only option you have is a very long, hard road with a lot of work. And even then, you're not going to kind of get back to where you were. What do you do in that situation? Or maybe it's a health issue. Maybe the doctor has kind of told you, hey, you've got this thing, you've got this issue, and it's not going to go away. What do you do in those kind of situations? Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that we're tempted to do is to run or to give up or to hide, and that's not good. Maybe you might be tempted to do something stupid, start drinking yourself into oblivion or just getting high all the time and trying to escape from it. But that doesn't help either. That just makes things worse. One of the things that we do, and it's interesting, is that when we find ourselves in these kind of seasons, it's really easy for us to look around and look at the people around us and compare our lives to them and just get the sense that everybody's life is perfect. Everyone else's life is wrinkle-free and problem-free, and we're like, why is this happening to me? And we become bitter and maybe even resentful. And so that's not good. Well, one of the things that we can do that is helpful, that when we're going through troubles, is to remember this, that the men and women that are in the Bible, these people were not were not strangers to adversity. They knew troubles. In fact, when you read their stories, you realize that conflict and persecution and troubles were just a normal part of their everyday lives. And I don't know what's happened, but somehow, some way, our American way of life has caused you and I to lose sight of the suffering that many of our Bible heroes actually had to endure. We've just kind of lost sight of that. And so we've kind of sanitized and romanticized our faith to the point that, trials and troubles and tribulations that come into our life, we automatically conclude that God has abandoned us, that He's left us. Where are you, God? Right? And we seem confused by this contradiction about this idea that God is good, and yet there's the presence of troubles and afflictions in our life. We can't kind of connect those two. But the people who brought us the story of Jesus, the people who brought us the Gospels, they were not confused by this, and they were not conflicted, and they didn't see any contradiction in the fact that their lives were full of troubles and trials, and yet they continued to still put their faith and their trust in God. In fact, we saw this last week play out when we looked at the life of the Apostle Paul, the great Apostle Paul. And, if you don't know the story, God handpicked Paul to take the gospel, the good news, to the whole world, to take it from the Jewish culture and to take it all around the world. And so Paul basically single-handedly planted churches all over Asia and all over the Mediterranean. Not only that, Paul wrote about half of the New Testament, right? And so he did these incredible things, and yet Paul had a situation in his life that was, do you remember this list here? It was painful, right? It was humiliating. It was debilitating, and it was permanent. Now, how could Paul reconcile that? God has called him to these great things that he wants him to do, and yet these things are present in Paul's life. And Paul, here's the thing, he asked God to remove those things. He asked God to take this thing away. 3 times he pleaded with him, and God said no. And you know what Paul did? He just kept right on trucking, man. He just kept on moving on. Somehow, for Paul, dealing with something that was painful and humiliating and debilitating and permanent, that didn't affect his trust in God. That didn't affect his faith in God. See, to Paul, there was no confusion. There was no contradiction. He was able to move forward and to do great things even when a part of his life was stuck and probably would never get better. That's amazing. And you and I, we look at this today and we're like, how did Paul do that? How could he do that? Well, today, what I want to do is I want to look at Paul's secret to dealing with adversity. Paul had a secret in dealing with troubles and trials and tribulations in his life. And in fact, in one of his writings, Paul shares his thoughts on a word that, it's kind of foreign to us, especially here in America. And that word is contentment. Contentment, right? I mean, we struggle with that, right, in America. And what is that? What is contentment? Well, contentment very simply is having the ability to be at peace on the inside, even when things are out of control on the outside. Contentment is this ability to not stress out and to not keep striving inside of you, even when externally everything is going crazy around you. Paul said this, that through Christ, there is a way for you and I to achieve contentment, even when we feel discontented about things that are happening to us. Now, before I jump into that, I want to give you a little bit of background on Paul's life because it'll help you maybe believe some of the things that he's about to tell us here and appreciate it a little bit more. So, the simple story is that Paul basically stepped onto the pages of history as a person who hated Christians. That was what he was known for. That was what he was famous for. In fact, if you're one of those people and you don't like Christians too much, you would have loved Paul. I mean, you would have loved him. In fact, if you know a few Christians that you think should be put in jail, you really would have loved Paul because putting Christians in jail was Paul's favorite thing. He went all over the world trying to put and imprison Christians into jails. And so, but here's the thing. One day, and it was fascinating to the world, one day, Paul, this famous Christian arrester and persecutor and even murderer, decided to become a Christian himself. I mean, this blew everybody's mind. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he began traveling all over the world, telling anyone and everyone that he could that Jesus was the Son of God and that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Now, I just want you to know, that decision did not make Paul's life any easier. In fact, when he made that decision, his life got a lot harder and a lot more difficult. Paul, in those next few years, Paul was beaten up. I mean, he had the stew beat out of him so many times, and he was persecuted, and he was chased out of town and had to escape in the middle of the night to save his life, all right? In fact, it's interesting, about 10 years into this missionary endeavor, okay, Paul himself was put under arrest. He was put in jail while awaiting a trial in Rome. He was in Rome and he was put under arrest. And you might know the story that the Roman emperor at this time was a guy by the name of Nero. Nero was a pretty nasty fella, and Nero had a very special place in his heart for Christians as well. He wanted to kill them all. He hated them, and he imprisoned them and tortured them and put them to death. In fact, there's stories about how he dipped Christians in hot wax and that he would hang them from trees and then he would light them on fire to kind of be like torches in the palace gardens as you walked around night, kind of like night lights. He was using Christians for night lights. This was brutal, brutal, brutal. And so here's Paul. He's a Christian, right? And he is under arrest in Rome, okay, awaiting trial before Nero. This is not a good combination for Paul. This is not going to end up good for him. Paul knows this. He knows that things are going to get worse for him. And in fact, the truth is that from the world's point of view, at this point in history, it was clear that the Roman Empire had won and that the kingdom of God had lost. It was very clear to everybody that Nero had won and that Jesus and Paul, they had lost. But here's the fascinating thing, and here's the really, really cool part, is that while Paul was under arrest, awaiting to be put to death, okay, he couldn't go anywhere. He couldn't do anything. Paul did something very simple, something very small, but incredibly remarkable. Now, I want you to understand, this situation that Paul was in, being under arrest, being in jail, couldn't have been easy for him. Paul was a super ambitious guy. I mean, when he was a Pharisee, when he was a Jew, he was the greatest of them. He was super passionate. He was nutty. He would go all over, like I said, arresting Christians. And when he became a Christian, boy, he went all out on that. I mean, he wasn't one of those, oh, whatever, okay, we'll just kind of go with the flow here, man. Paul was driven, he was passionate, and he had a huge vision for his life. And his vision was to take the gospel throughout the whole world, okay? That was his heart. And so Paul is sitting there in this jail cell, and he's got to be thinking to himself, I've got all this time on my hands, I've got nothing to do, what can I do? And I think he kind of goes, what I guess I could do? I guess I could maybe write a few letters to some of my friends. And so he began to write some letters. But little did Paul know that these letters would become some of the most widely read and most widely translated pieces of literature in the history of literature. He had no idea. In Paul's mind, he's like, well, there's nothing I can do here. I'm stuck. I can't go forward, and I definitely can't go back. Might as well make the best of it. I think I'll write a few notes to some of my fellow Christians that I've met over the last few years. And here's the fascinating thing, that the letters that Paul wrote while he was in jail have become known in history as the prison epistles. The prison epistles, right? And these are just basically letters that he wrote to different churches. Like the church in Ephesus has become known as the letter to the Ephesians, or the church in Philippi, he wrote a letter to the Philippians, and Colossia, and he wrote these to Colossians and Philemon, which was a friend of his. And so these letters began to be spread all throughout the Mediterranean. And I just want you to understand this. In Paul's mind, he's just like, well, there's nothing else I can do. I'm just stuck here. I can't do much, so I might as well I guess I could write a letter, right? But in reality, Paul was changing the world with these letters. I mean, he was literally changing people's view of who God was through these letters. These letters that he wrote, I mean, this is fascinating, would ultimately lead to the demise of the Roman Empire. These letters were spread throughout the Roman Empire, and about 100 years later, about a century later, the emperor of Rome was Nero. He hated Christians. About 200 years later, as these letters got spread all over Europe, Constantine rose up, and he made Christianity the official religion of Rome. It flipped it upside down. In fact, I would suggest to you that what Paul wrote would become so well read and so treasured that I could argue that besides Jesus, Paul did more to change Western and shape Western civilization than anything else or anybody else, all the way up to probably the printing press, right? I mean, that really changed the world. Back 1450, Gutenberg developed the printing press. This is fascinating. And the first book that he printed, guess what it was? The Bible, which contained these letters that were written by Paul while he was in prison hundreds of years before. It's just mind-blowing. It's incredible. And the thing that's even crazier is that what are the odds that these little letters that Paul wrote would survive history? I mean, kings would write, emperors would write letters, and they would be saved and all of that and be passed around. And we don't have many of those. I mean, emperors would write letters that they wanted to be taken for posterity's sake and to remember the history of what they did, and they'd be put away in vaults, and there would be many copies made. And we don't have any of those. History has not preserved those. And yet here we have Paul writing a letter, handing it to some servant and saying, hey, would you send this through a ship somehow to Ephesus? One copy. And thousands of years later, we're still reading these letters. This is crazy. Maybe you're not as impressed with this as I am. Maybe. Well, let me give you one more. Ladies, gals, this is fascinating. In one of the letters that Paul wrote while he was in prison, the book of Ephesians, Paul said something that was just absolutely groundbreaking in relation to relationships between men and women. He said this. He said, husbands, love your wives. In fact, love your wives just as Jesus loved the church. What did he do? Jesus laid down his life for her, and you should do the same for your wives. Come on, gals. Aren't you glad that God put Paul in a jail cell and gave him a pen and said, hey, write something, boy? That stuff is gold. That is gold. That has changed the world. And so what I want you to just understand here is that a big chunk of the New Testament was written by Paul while he was stuck in a place that he didn't want to be. And this is my point. This is my point. Paul had no idea. Paul had no idea what hung in the balance with his decision to remain faithful when remaining faithful was really difficult to do. Let me repeat that. Paul had no idea what was hanging in the balance with his decision to remain faithful when remaining faithful was difficult. I mean, think about this a little bit here. One of the reasons that Paul was able to achieve what he did was because of his adversity, not in spite of it. In fact, God put him in a jail cell to unleash something on the world. I mean, the adversity that Paul faced and the trials that he endured and the pain that he experienced created the opportunity for Paul to literally change the world. This is amazing. And in the same way, I would suggest to you that you and I today have no idea of what or even who hangs in the balance of our decision to stay faithful, even when staying faithful isn't easy to do. We have no idea what's on the other side of this. You have no idea what God might be up to through your faithfulness when everyone and everything around you is telling you to give up on your faith and to give up on God and just to go and run and hide and let it go. You have no idea. And here's the problem. You will never know. You'll never know. You'll never know what will happen unless you stick with it while you're stuck in it. You'll never know. And I just want you to understand this, that we talked about this the last couple of weeks. Contrary to popular opinion, when we're stuck, God isn't absent. God isn't apathetic, and God isn't angry. The truth is that God is at work. God is at work. He's doing something in us and through us that he couldn't have done any other way. We have to believe that. And so, it's in one of these letters, the letters to the Philippian church, the Philippians, that Paul talks about this issue of contentment and how to find it in your life. Now, I want you to remember, again, Paul, right now at this time when he's writing this, he's under house arrest, okay? He is going to face Nero, and execution is probably the end result. Paul isn't 100% sure what's going to happen, but he knows that it's probably not going to change. It's not going to get better for him. But what he does in the midst of that trial, he writes down this huge, big, bold statement that doesn't make sense to a lot of us. And it didn't make sense to some of the people that he wrote it to. He writes down this huge statement to his friends in Philippi. In Philippians chapter 4, verse 10, he kind of goes into this. He says this. He starts off and he says, I rejoice in the Lord greatly because once again you have renewed your care for me. In fact, the truth is that you were always concerned about me, but you lacked the opportunity to show it. Now, let me explain what he's kind of saying here. Paul had been arrested, right? And he was arrested in Rome, and news traveled slowly back then, right? And so it took a long time for the people in Philippi to hear that Paul was in trouble. And as soon as they heard it, they gathered together some stuff, and they put together a care package, and they had it shipped back to Paul, who was in Rome. Well, meanwhile, Paul's just rotting in a cell, rotting in this place, and all of a sudden he gets this care package, and he's like, whoa, you guys didn't forget me. This is awesome. You guys sent me a care package. Thank you. Now, you might wonder what was in the care package, and people have talked about it, maybe some scrolls, that Paul could read. Could be maybe some video games, I don't know. Probably a cloak, some sort of coat to keep him warm. It was cold, but all of those things, didn't matter what those things. Paul was super grateful for this package that came to him. But here's the thing. He uses this event as a launching pad to talk to these guys about a bigger issue that he wanted to talk to them about. Contentment. Now look at this. This is brilliant. He says, I am not saying this because I am in need. Now, let me just stop there. In other words, what he is saying is I'm glad that you remembered me. I really am. And I'm glad that you sent me this care package, and I'm really thankful for it. But I'm not telling you that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not telling you that I'm thankful for it because I'm afraid or because I'm stressed out or because I'm freaking out because of my situation. That's not why I'm saying this. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned. Now, Paul, think about that. In other words, I have gone through a little bit of life here. In other words, I've learned something. It didn't come naturally to me. It wasn't instinctive to me. I had to process, and it took time. And I have learned something. What have you learned? I have learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. I have learned to be content. I have learned to not let troubles and trials drag me down. I have learned not to let problems stress me out. I've learned not to allow persecutions cause me to want to give up. I have learned to do that. I have learned to be content in every situation. Now, this is magic to me because when I read that, I don't know about you, but when I read that statement, I'm like, I want to learn that. That can be taught. I would love to have that. I just thought people were naturally cool under pressure, and that's just the way you're born. But Paul said you could be learned, it could be taught. And if there's a way for me to be okay on the inside when everything on the outside of me is falling apart, man, sign me up for that class. Show me how to do that, Paul, please, right? And especially when you feel stuck. Especially when you're in that place where there's nothing left you can do, when there's no way forward and there's no way back. Wouldn't it be great if you were in one of those situations that you could at least be able to go, okay, I'm okay. I'm okay. I am content. I'm content. Now, not, whatever, or oh gosh, oh well, or oh, I got to forget what I'm going through. I don't want to act like it's real. No. That's not what Paul is saying, and that's not how Paul was. Paul wasn't like that. Paul was a man of extremes. I mean, this guy was hot or cold. When he was a Pharisee and a Jew, he was the greatest, most passionate Jew there was. And when he became a Christian, man, he was all the way on that. I mean, when he was a Pharisee, he was out to kill all the Christians. And when he became a Christian, he began to win the world. He wanted to win everyone to the Lord. That was how he was. And so Paul would say, in spite of my personality, and in spite of my circumstances that I'm going through, I have learned to be content. I have learned to be content. I'm okay with the things that I can't change. Verse 12, he goes on. He says something. He says, I know what it is to be in need. I've experienced that. And I also know what it is to have plenty. This is interesting. Paul would say, you know what? There have been times in my life when I've had much more than I needed. But here's the thing I didn't do. I didn't get addicted to that. I didn't get addicted to having more. Why? So that when I was in need, I wouldn't be all that unhappy, right? I wouldn't be unhappy. I'd be fine. Having a lot, I wasn't going to allow having a lot to steal my contentment when I had just a little. This is brilliant. And so then Paul says something, and I just love this. This is the setup. He says, listen, I have learned the secret. I have learned a secret. That, in other words, not everybody knows this. I have learned something. And the secret of being content in every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want. Now, I can imagine when the Philippians opened this letter and began reading it, they get to this part and they're like, oh man, Paul, tell us, please tell us the secret to being content in every circumstance. And we trust that you know what you're talking about because you have been to hell and back, man. You have been snake bitten, you've been shipwrecked, you've been beaten up in every town that you visited. And those are just the good days. I mean, like today, you're in prison in Rome awaiting to get your head cut off. Paul, what is the secret to finding contentment? How do you do this? And in the next verse, Paul tells us the secret. Now, before I share it with you, I just want to make this statement. This next verse that I'm going to read to you is one of the most famous Christian verses in the Bible, okay? But it's also one of the most misused verses in the Bible. And I say that because this verse is so easy and it is so simple to memorize that unfortunately it often gets misapplied and used out of context. And so before I read this, I want to remind you of what the context of what Paul is saying here. The context of this verse is that right now, what we're going to read here in a second, this is the Apostle Paul's summary on how to find contentment in the midst of a chaotic and even a life-threatening situation. That's what he's talking about. So the Philippians are like, Paul, tell us how to find contentment that you're talking about. And in verse 13 of chapter 4 of Philippians, Paul said, I can do all this. What is this, Paul? Well, I can be beat up, I can be persecuted, I can be stoned to death, I can be run out of town, I can be put in a jail in Rome waiting my execution and not be stressed out and not give up and not go, Nero is my Lord, and capitulate. I can do all of this, right? What can you do? I can do all of this, Paul says, through Christ. Through Christ, who gives me strength. Now, I am absolutely positive that Paul says that Christ is giving him strength. He's not speaking figuratively here. He's not like, well, I have some hope and it's going to get me through. I believe that Paul is talking literally. In fact, if I could change this, I think Paul would say, I can do all of this through Christ who gives me his strength. Who gives me his strength, his power, his ability to endure, and his ability to overcome any obstacle that this world throws at him. And the reason I'm sure that Paul meant this, and that's what he's talking about, is because in other letters that Paul wrote, Paul talked a little bit about this mystery. We're talking about a secret here, but Paul talked about this mystery, and I love it. This mystery. Paul said that there is a mystery for Christians. There's a mystery for believers where the life of Jesus and the power of Jesus and the strength of Jesus and the endurance of Jesus is available to us through Christ. That the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is inside of us. Paul said, I can do all of this. I can go through all of this suffering, all of this heartbreak, all of this loneliness. I can do all of that through Christ, who literally gives me his strength. Wow. Now, I just want to stop here for a minute, and I want to just clarify a little bit, and I want to be a tiny bit critical, because let me tell you what Paul is not talking about, all right? He is not talking about this. And there's nothing super wrong about this. This is pretty sweet. This is nice. This is clearly a Christian high school, and they're having a football game, and the cheerleaders made a big banner for the football team that's going to make their entrance onto the football field to play this game, right? But I imagine that when Paul looks down at this from heaven, he's like, really? Really? Because that's not quite what I meant. I wrote these words while I was stuck in a prison cell awaiting my execution. I mean, you are using it to inspire your guys to go out and win a football game. But that's not what I'm talking about. That's what I was talking about. I wasn't talking about winning. I was talking about surviving. I was talking about just making it and enduring. Now, again, I don't want to get too critical over this because that's nice. But here's the thing you need to understand. If you take this verse out of context, you will miss the secret to finding contentment in this world. Because this is the key. Finding contentment, the ability to be okay on the inside, even when things on the outside are out of control. The ability, contentment, the ability to keep your composure when all hell is breaking loose. When the doctor walks into the room and tells you a bad report, or your business or your marriage is about to tank, you can say, I have learned a secret of being content in any and every situation. And what's that secret? I can do all things through Christ who gives me his strength, who puts his strength inside of me, who literally and supernaturally gives me the power to carry on. If I could, here at the end here, I just want to simplify this. So maybe it's easier for you to kind of walk away with it if you can. Here's what I'll do. Number one, write this down. I can't. I can't. But he can. And he can through me. That's the truth that Paul understood. I can't. I'm a pretty sharp guy. I'm pretty smart. I'm pretty capable. You know, I've got a great job. I've got a real nice car, wonderful family, got a sweet 401k that's just rocking right now. But when it comes to this problem, when it comes to this situation, I can't handle this. I can't deal with this. But Jesus can. That should be the next thought. He can. And how do I know that Jesus can? Because when Jesus carried his own cross up that hill and allowed himself to be crucified and killed for my sins, that proved once and for all, hey, this is nothing compared to that. He can handle it. He can easily do that. I can. I can't. I can't. But he can. And he can through me. He wants to do it through me. Maybe you're single and you're just tired of being single. You're tired of the single life, and so maybe recently, you know, especially during the pandemic, you were just lonely. You tried to not be single. You hooked up with some guy, shacked up with some guy, and it just made things much more worse in your life. And finally, you kind of woken up and you're like, man, I got to get out of this situation, and you've moved out. But there's a pull on your heart, and you're thinking about maybe I should go back, or maybe we start over, you know. And it's because of loneliness, and you're just like, I just don't want to be lonely anymore. I can't. But he can. And he can through me. Maybe you're married and things have gotten difficult recently, you know, and it just seems like every time you hear the garage door open, or maybe you come home and you open the garage door and you roll in there, and you're wondering who you're going to meet when you walk into the house, because there's about 3 different versions of him, and there are about 3 different versions of her, and you're never really certain who you're going to be running into on this, who you're going to be dealing with. And you think to yourself, God, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep doing this. I can't. And God's like, you're right, you can't, but I can. And I can through you. Maybe the doctor's giving you the report and it ain't good. And he's like, hey, you know, we can treat it a little bit, we can monitor it, but we can't cure it. And you're like, I can't do this. I don't think I can do this. But he can. And he can through you. And maybe you're hearing this and you're just like, how? How is that possible? How does this work? And I think Paul would say, you know what? I don't know if I could explain it to you, because it's a mystery. It's a mystery, but it's true. And the truth is that because Jesus lives, and because Jesus lives in you, you can do all things through him who gives you his strength. Hope you believe that. I want to pray. Father, I just lift up my church family, and I know that people everywhere are listening to this, and somebody out there is struggling and is hurting and doesn't think that they can make it and go another day. I pray that this word will get deep down inside of their heart, that you would plant the seeds of truth of this word, that yes, they can't, but with you they can. Through you they can make it. And Lord, I pray that that would begin to sprout in their life tomorrow morning, and that they begin to have hope, and that supernaturally some power would begin to move into their life to help them put their next foot in front of the other and begin to move forward and to trust that you are going to get them through, that they can endure all things, that they can survive all things through Christ, God. Help my friends understand that there is a power, there is a mystery. We can't explain it, but it is true nonetheless that the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is inside of these bodies. Help us to lean into that. Help us to remind ourselves of that. Help us to walk everywhere we go thinking about that and knowing that truth, so that regardless of whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, that there can be peace. We can be at peace and say, you know what? I'm content. I'm content. Lord, help us to do that, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. See you next week, guys.
Creation knows the voice that's spoken to the void, the breath that brought the dust to life and sang the stars to form. The darkness fears your voice that drove it back before. And though the night is long, I know your light will drive it back once more. One word from you, things change on your authority. Your word is true. Things change on your authority. Jesus, I know the fight is not my own. Its end is in your hands. I worship you because I know all things must bow to your command. We believe it. One word from you, things change on your authority. Your word is true. Things change on your authority. One word from you, things change on your authority. Your word is true. It's true. Things change on your authority. Will heaven not prevail and strongholds not be moved? Will spirits not be silenced and cower at his word? For if my God is for me, then what have I to fear? For nothing will deny him the glory that is his. Will